Welcome to this episode of the ASCOR Explainer series. My name is Sylvan Lutz, and I'm an analyst at the Transition Pathway Initiative Centre based at the London School of Economics. In today's episode, I'll walk you through the emissions trends area in the ASCOR framework. The ASCOR framework is built on three pillars that assess different aspects of a country's climate performance. Each pillar covers relevant areas in line with its theme. Emissions trends is located within the first pillar, emissions pathways. If you're interested in any further information on these areas, please take a look at the ASCOR Framework Methodology Note, available in the link below the slide. Today's presentation will have three parts. First, I'll talk about why we assess emissions trends and what kind of emissions trends we assess. Second, I'll talk about how the ASCOR methodology assesses emissions trends. And finally, I'll present some results from the 2024 assessments and show you what further information you can find on our website. To start with, ASCOR assesses emissions trends primarily because rapidly reducing emissions is key to achieving climate stability and is a central goal of the Paris Climate Agreement. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, or UNEP, global greenhouse gas emissions must fall by 42% from 2019 levels by 2030 to meet the 1.5 degrees temperature goal. As of 2024-2025, we are well off track. Historical emissions trends show us the impact of a country's most recent greenhouse gas reduction actions, and these trends can also kind of hint or suggest the level of commitment to future greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We look at absolute emissions as well as per capita and GDP adjusted emissions to reflect countries' differing socioeconomic circumstances and make those trends more comparable across different countries. Finally, we take a look at three different emissions categories to reveal complementary aspects of a country's emissions profile, together with the adjusted trends providing a more complete picture of a country's mitigation actions. When I talk about different emissions categories and different emissions metrics, I mean that ASCOR looks at a total of 9 different ways of measuring a country's emissions split across 3 categories and 3 adjusted measurements. First, we take a look at the 3 emissions categories, which are production-based emissions, excluding land use change, and forestry, or LULUCF. Second, we take a look at production-based emissions that are LULUCF only. And third, we take a look at consumption-based emissions, excluding LULUCF. Production-based emissions are those emissions generated within a country's territorial boundaries or within their borders through economic activity. LULUCF emissions are emissions generated or sequestered due to changes in carbon sinks related to land management, again, inside a country's borders. Consumption-based emissions complement these by looking at trade-adjusted emissions, and they are emissions that are associated with the production of goods and services consumed within a country, regardless of where those emissions occur. Finally, we take a look at absolute emissions, so total emissions from the relevant emissions boundary discussed above, and we adjust them by per capita intensity and GDP intensity to break down the country's emissions profile and provide a more comparable format across countries with different socioeconomic circumstances. To assess emissions trends, ASCOR uses 3 indicators and 2 metrics. The first indicator looks at if a country has improved its emissions profile over the last 5 years across all those emissions categories and metrics that I discussed. We look at the most recent emissions level in the most recent year that we have data for, and then we also look at recent trends across several time periods. We then look at if the 5-year trend is aligned with meeting a country's 1.5 degree benchmark in 2030 and 1.5 degree fair share benchmark, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. To assess emissions trends, ASCOR looks at each category of greenhouse gas emissions over the last year, 3 years, and 5 years. If 2/3 of the 5-year trends are decreasing, we assess a country as having improved its emissions profile. To evaluate whether these trends align with the 1.5 degree Paris climate goals, we extrapolate emissions from the 5-year trend linearly to 2030 and compare this with the country-specific 1.5 degree cost-effective and 1.5 degree fair share benchmarks. Both of these benchmarks are ways of downscaling the global carbon budget to country-specific levels, and both offer different methodologies of doing this. To find out more about the benchmarks we use in the ASCOR framework, please watch the EP2 or 2030 targets video in the ASCOR video series. ASCOR uses emissions data from PRIMAP to measure production-based emissions and production-based LULUCF emissions, and from the Global Carbon Atlas to look at consumption emissions. We also take 1.5 degree cost-effective benchmarks from climate analytics. Now I'd like to show you some of our results and the information you can find on the ASCOR website. In our 2024 results, we were glad to see that a majority of countries have improved their emissions profile over the past 5 years. This means that they have decreasing emissions trends across at least 2/3 of the categories that we assess. However, the lack of alignment with 1.5-degree benchmarks demonstrates that we are far from limiting global warming to safe levels. None of the 44 countries for which we have a cost-effective 1.5-degree benchmark have had 5-year emissions trends aligned with this benchmark in 2030. Only 21% or 1/5 of countries have trends aligned with meeting their 1.5-degree fair share benchmarks. If you want to dive deeper into countries' emissions trends, you can check out the ASCOR tool on the TPI Centre website. Here's an example of a graph that you can create for yourself on the bottom of the host page. I've selected G7 countries and their per capita emissions trends, as you can see on the left side of the graph, to show you how it's useful to compare countries with similar socioeconomic statuses across similar metrics. Here you can see that Canada and the United States have much higher levels of per capita intensity emissions than their European and Asian counterparts, and that the UK, in pink, has seen the most significant reduction in per capita intensity emissions on this graph for the better performing countries. If you want to dive even deeper into specific country emission trends, you can find information on each country's page on the ASCOR tool. Here I'm highlighting Estonia as the best performer in the 2024 ASCOR emissions trends results. And you can see that in absolute production emissions here, in intensity per GDP emissions, and in intensity per capita emissions, Estonia has seen significant decreases over a number of periods, and consistent reductions across all categories, like in Estonia, is likely to represent a comprehensive decoupling of emissions from factors like economic and population growth, and this is something we'll need to see across all countries if we are to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement and stabilize the global climate system. This wraps up our overview of the emissions trend area of the ASCOR framework. If you'd like to learn more about ASCOR or explore other episodes of the ASCOR Explainer series, please visit our website. Thank you for watching.